panel with joining us. I want to leave them as much time as possible, so I will just briefly introduce them. Dr. Mark Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He is the author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. His next project, A Tale of Two Campuses, Jews and Identity Politics in the Golden State, traces his experiences as a Jewish professor at both right-wing and left-wing universities. Dr. Miriam F. Ellman is Executive Director of the Academic Engagement Network and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University, where she holds the title of Robert D. McClure Professor of Teaching Excellence at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She has edited and co-edited and is the author of over 6 books, and is the author of over 65 journal articles and book chapters on topics related to contemporary anti-Semitism, peace and conflict resolution, and the nexus between religion and politics in Israel and the Middle East. And Dr. Alvin H. Rosenfeld holds the Irving M. Glaser Chair in Jewish Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, and is the director of the university's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He founded Indiana University's Bourne's Jewish Studies program and served as its director for 30 years. His most recent book, Anti-Zionism and Antisemitism, The Dynamics of Delegitimization, was published in 2019, and Contending with Antisemitism in a Rapidly Changing Political Climate is due to be published in the fall of this year. Our moderator tonight, Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, is the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. An experienced educator, she has researched, taught, and written on Jewish culture and history. She regularly speaks on the Holocaust, topics in Jewish history and culture, and the history covered in the museum's core and special exhibitions. I'd now like to turn the discussion over to our panel. Sarah?
Thank you, Mary Pat. And thank you, Alvin and Miriam and Mark for joining us this evening for this unfortunately extremely timely discussion. So tonight we're going to focus on the current state of anti-Semitism in the United States. But before we do that, let's just take a few moments to look back at anti-Semitism in the United States as it emerged and developed. And I would like each one of you just to give a couple of minutes of what you see as a few trends that have emerged or changed historically over the past several decades. And I'll just ask to go in the order of which I see you on my screen. So we'll start with Mark, and then we'll move to Miriam, and then we'll talk with you, Alvin, and then we'll move from there. Okay, so Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. Honored to be here and with my distinguished colleagues. I want to go back to pre-World War II. I think it gives a good narrative arc because for American Jews, the story has been so good for so long, and it's so bad for some moments. And I think the challenge we have, especially for white Ashkenazi Jews, is how we can sociologically be so well off, yet because of persistent anti-Semitism, constantly have to face and reface it. 1920s and 30s was an awful time, right to the federal level where the United States Congress was passing anti-Semitic immigration legislation. And through World War II, of course, we're getting a whole lot on this side of the Atlantic that was occurring, in Nazi Germany. The data tells us after World War II through the 1950s, domestic anti-Semitism dropped precipitously. This is when scholars, note that Jews were welcomed into white suburban communities that previously were anti-Black and anti-Jewish. We had sporadic, right-wing groups in the 1970s that would pop up, but really didn't gain all that much traction. And then I think the reason probably that we're here now is the last 5 years or so has seen in this country, and I know you're going to be talking about global anti-Semitism in the future, all over the world, what has been quite surprising, I think, to a whole lot of American Jews to see how intense it became, how quickly, at a moment that we would have thought it wouldn't happen.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Miriam.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Annie, and thank you, Sarah, for organizing this and for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure. I just want to pick up on something that Mark pointed out, that it seems like it's so much worse now, but even so, we need to put it in perspective. And I'm going to speak quite a bit tonight on the campus situation. But if you think back, there used to be quotas to keep Jews out of elite colleges. And now we have colleges that have Jewish presidents. So we do need to keep the issue in perspective. I would argue that, and I'll just say at the start, there is no crisis of anti-Semitism on America's campuses. There's nearly 5,000 universities and colleges in the United States, and the vast majority are not impacted by anti-Semitism, but there's a few hundred, among them some of the most prestigious and some with very high Jewish enrollments, where we are seeing an uptick in anti-Semitism. Hillel is reporting that on the 550 colleges and universities that it serves, anti-Semitism is today at an all-time high with nearly 200 incidents last academic year. The ADL is also reporting a 90% rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses since 2016. So we're at a moment, right? But even in this moment, we have to realize that there's a lot of good, both on and off the campus for American Jews, and in a number of ways, the trend is positive rather than negative.
Thank you. Alvin.
I'm a little less optimistic than Miriam is, but we'll talk it through tonight, I'm sure. First, let me join those of my colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be with them and with you for listening. Mark very ably sketched in a bit some of the earlier history of anti-Semitism in America, and he's certainly to remind people that in the 20s and 30s, it could get very rough. At the height of the civil rights movement, similarly, especially in the South. So what we're seeing today is not quite of a piece with what we saw before, but there are continuities between today and past as well. What's especially shocking about anti-Semitism today, though, is that it's post-Holocaust anti-Semitism. I realize our program tonight is being sponsored by the Dallas Holocaust Museum. I'm a scholar of the Holocaust myself. I've spoken actually at a museum on the Holocaust years ago. However, for the life of me, would I have thought that in the year 2021, I would be back via Zoom talking not about the Holocaust, but about contemporary anti-Semitism in America. It's necessary to do it. It's essential to do it. And whenever these discussions arise, there's always the question, does Holocaust work? What have we done or not done that we see anti-Semitism coming back as virulently as Mary Pat correctly said it was? The other thing that's new about today's anti-Semitism, and Mark didn't mention it because he covered earlier centuries prior to 1948, was no state of Israel. And much of today's anti-Semitism is anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. I'm sure we'll be talking more about it, but in many ways, the most fervid kind of Jew hatred today is directed at the Jewish state.
Okay. All right. You've brought up many points that we will, in fact, be touching upon in our conversation tonight. The next thing I guess I would like to talk with you about is your sense of where do you think people believe anti-Semitism comes from in the United States? And the reason I ask where do you believe it comes from is because I'm trying to get at whether you think that where they think it comes from and where it actually comes from are one and the same thing, because frequently those are different things. I guess this time I will start with Miriam. And again, because your areas of specialization are different, I would be happy to have any one of you take lead on any one of these questions, but we'll start with you, Miriam, and then we'll go from there. Okay?
Yeah, I'm going to just take 1 second on this one because I want you to leave me a little bit more time when we get to the anti-Zionism part.
I thought that might be the case.
But I did just want to throw out that based on the Pew survey of American Jewry, American Jews are really concerned about anti-Semitism today, far more than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I like data, so I'm just going to read out that according to the Pew survey, based on the survey they did in 2020, 3/4 of American Jews believe there's more anti-Semitism in the United States today than there was 5 years ago. And 53% feel personally less safe. And I can tell you that, up here in central New York, we have a small Jewish community. All our synagogues and our Jewish day school have security. We have bars, we put in security doors, and we have a law enforcement officer at our school. And we didn't have that 5 years ago. So I want to hear from my colleagues about the sources, but I just wanted to throw out that American Jews are very concerned, and they're fortifying their houses of worship and their schools as a result.
Well, and I would add before we go to you two gentlemen, that in Dallas as well, we've got a larger Jewish community, somewhere between 62 and 72,000 Jews. So it's not insubstantial when compared to New York. It is, but and also all synagogues, schools, there are armed guards, extra security, fences have gone up around facilities. JCC as well has a guard at all times and barricades. So this has developed over the past several years.
And up here we only have 8,000 Jews.
Yeah,
probably a little less now, but there are no bars or law enforcement police officers at churches or mosques, but there are at the synagogues and the Jewish day schools.
Okay. Alvin or Mark, whichever wants to go first, whoever wants to go first, excuse me.
I'll be glad to, and I'll pick up on what Sarah, you and Miriam just said. I've gone back and forth to Europe over many years for my research. And it's common in Europe for Jewish institutions of every kind to have protection. It hasn't been so common, as Miriam rightly said, and as you confirmed, Sarah, in this country, but it's not just Syracuse and Dallas. I venture to say that probably every synagogue, every Jewish school, every Jewish community center in the United States today has security of some kind or another. That's new to us. Jews are very uneasy in the present situation. The last few weeks have been especially intense. And are Jews concerned? For sure they're concerned. Is there a reason for them to be concerned? You bet there is. Where does the anti-Semitism come from? It comes from several different sources. But let me just mention 4 major episodes of physical against Jews to help identify where it's coming from. The most notorious was the Pittsburgh assault, and the person who in fact attacked the Tree of Life synagogue there, killing 11 Jews and wounding some as well, was a white supremacist and white nationalist, no question about that. 6 months later, that was followed up by an assault on a Chabad synagogue in Poway, California. And once again, the assailant was a white supremacist, in his case as well, a Christian nationalist. But then there were 2 further physical assaults, one against a Jewish supermarket in Jersey City, and the assailants there who went in with guns, as was the case in Pittsburgh and Poway, belonged to, and Mark may want to speak a little bit about this himself because he's devoted attention to Black Jewish interconnections, to an offshoot of a kind of religion called Black Hebrew Israelite religion. The 4th episode that I would mention took place in Monsey, New York during Hanukkah, when a Hanukkah celebration in a rabbi's home was interrupted by a guy who went in with a machete and began stabbing Jews. One of the rabbi was in critical condition in the hospital for several months and died. And he too belonged to this sectarian group, Black Hebrew Israelites. So it's not by any means monolithic. Jews are targeted today by people on the extreme right, including the people I mentioned, supremacist Christian nationalists, neo-Nazi types, by certain people within segments of the Black communities of America. And I want to keep segments in place there because it's certainly not the entirety of the Black community, but within pockets of Black America, there's a good deal of anti-Semitism. There is some coming from Muslims, mostly preaching and doing propaganda, but more recently, during the recent war between Israel and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, sometimes on the street as well. And then there is a good deal ideological, political anti-Semitism, turning in particular against Israel. Miriam, no doubt, will talk more about this a bit later. So we're getting it from a number of sides, in fact, which makes it more and more difficult to comprehend for the average person, somewhat more difficult to protect against.
Mark.
Yeah, so there's a great deal here. I'll add a few others. First snarky and then serious. Where does anti-Semitism come from? The opposite side of wherever your politics are, right? And Deborah Lipstadt has talked about this, right? If you're on the political left, the anti-Semitism is from the right and vice versa. And I think the job of scholars and certainly the job of us in education is to sort of lift above that, to depoliticize this so that we can understand in more subtle and powerful terms what's going on. I'd like to introduce the idea of American exceptionalism, or perhaps the failure of American exceptionalism and American Jewish, which is to say, there is for many of us, especially those of us in the white community, in the white Jewish community, a notion that the United States is different and better than any other country in the world right now, and for the Jewish experience, better than most any other time and place. And I think we've sort of acculturated ourselves to this notion, and connected to this is the thought that there's no anti-Semitism here and there's no Jew hatred here. And what we're coming up against with the anti-Semitism spikes and what Alvin said, you know, how surprising it is as a Holocaust scholar to be dealing with this in the post-Holocaust world, is really confronting the possibility that this pluralistic democracy is not as successful as we had already thought. And also then another thing Alvin mentioned for transparency, when there's those murders in New Jersey by the Black Israelites, when the FBI did their survey of the social media posts of one of the murderers, they actually found that I was on his list because he'd read my Black Power book and considered white Jews to be imposters and blasphemous. And therefore I, as the author of that book, was threatened. And my friends lovingly joked, it's a good thing you didn't take the job in New Jersey, because I'm 2,500 miles away. But it did give me a quick immersion in how anti-Semitism comes from folks who are pretending to be the chosen ones as well, to the point of an eliminationist theology, which is that anyone else who's claiming to be what they claim to own is now forming an anti-Semitism. It's not really from the inside, but it appears to be from the inside.
Okay, so thank you all of you for that, because it's a really good overview of what's going on. So this is neither a problem of the left or a problem of the right, or really a problem of the center. I mean, this is simply a problem of Jewish existence right now, for better or worse, in the United States. So I guess my next question would be, why the dramatic increase now? And by now, I don't mean the war in Gaza, and we'll come to that when we talk about Zionism, because this all, what you're describing, Muncie and Poway and Pittsburgh, these all predate the current clashes between Israel and Hamas. So what's going on?
I'll jump in. So for now, I'll talk about the last, let's say, 5 years. On the political right, we have the rise of nationalism here in the United States and around the world. In a certain sense, I don't know that that these anti-Semites from the right are particularly new. I think they've always been around. And I think the political culture in this country and elsewhere is really centering that and sort of creating a culture where one will perceive themselves to be on the leading edge of politics, if they are, in this case, anti-Semitic, and there's a whole bunch of other antis that come in. On the political left, it's actually less related to the last 5 years, and Alvin mentioned before the breakup of the Civil Rights Alliance in the mid-60s. And this is the notion of Jews as powerful. And this trope, this anti-Semitic trope, has ebbed and flowed, but I believe it has been a constant undercurrent in aspects of the left. And I think that we're seeing it now, and we just bring it right into the Israel and Zionism part of it too, because I think that Jewish power, Jewish money, has been deployed by the left in very, I'll say, creative, meaning hidden ways, in order to advance really age-old stereotypes.
Okay.
I'll add a bit more. Unfortunately, America is in a very, very polarized, overwrought phase now. People's passions run high on all matters. People are at one another's throats, politically, socially, racially, economically, you name it. If I were to express my deepest wish, it would be for things to calm down. But they're not calming down. They're going in the opposite direction. Much of it is totally irrational, but nonetheless impassioned. People feel deeply, intensely, wrong-headedly, time and again, about who's responsible for the country's problems. So we're living at a time when there's a lot of, there are too many assaults against all kinds of people, but Asian Americans, for instance, are certainly coming in for physical assaults. Jews are the target that we're talking about tonight, they as well, for sure, but there are other groups considered who likewise just don't have an easy time of it in such an overwrought atmosphere as the one we're living in. We haven't had good political leadership, that's for sure, to calm things down, nor have we had good leadership within culture at large. Miriam will be talking, I'm sure, about the campus situations, and she's right to say America has, Miriam, I think you said something like 4,000 or 5,000 colleges and universities. So chronic anti-Semitism does not exist at most of those. I'm at a university that's 200 years old. We have about 37,000. We've never once had Israel Apartheid Week. We've never had BD. It's an Israel friendly, not an Israel hostile campus. But as Miriam suggested, a couple hundred campuses in the country where the opposite is the case. And my, oh my, oh my, has that come to the fore in crazy ways within the last few weeks. Again, Miriam, I'm sure, can chronicle that.
Miriam,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to add to both my colleagues, we're absolutely right. And, we know that anti-Semitism spikes during times of dislocation, periods of polarization, and, that's true historically and in other parts of the world. And we are at a moment, I think, and we have been at a moment for some years now of deep dislocation. There are many Americans who think that the system is rigged against them. Large swaths of America do not know or understand how the other part lives. Many whites see their world and their way of life as under threat. There is economic, social, political upheaval and unrest, as we know, and that's when scapegoats are sought, and the Jew serves that role. So it's not surprising, but I would say that the question is why the dramatic increase, and we have to talk about the internet. We just do. What has changed with the internet is the ease and speed with conspiracy theorizing about Jews can be shared, spread, disseminated. It is unbelievable. And it's not really my research, but there is an organization that's really doing incredible work. It's called the Network Contagion Research Institute, and there's a university affiliation with Rutgers. Does enormous work at really tracking both on the left, the right, the Hebrew Israelite, all brands of anti-Semitism, and the way in which they have really had a bonanza because of the internet, YouTube, social media. It really is a bonanza for Jew haters. The ADL in one report describes some of these internet sites as a 24/7 neo-Nazi rally. And if you look at this, right, and you start crunching the data, let's just take 1 year, 2017. The ADL released a report that in some 4 million tweets on some 3 million accounts, there was anti-Semitism. There are 5 channels on YouTube that have anti-Semitism. I'm talking about classic anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism, but real classic anti-Semitism. Those channels have been viewed 81 million times in the last 2 years. Gab, 8chan, Telegram, VK, Fascist Forge. And, let's talk for a minute, for just a second, about the Capitol riot, right? And the storming and ransacking in DC with this toxic mob. So could that mob have coalesced in the absence of the internet? Maybe, but I think the internet made it really easy to get hundreds of thousands of Americans hooked on lies and disinformation, and a lot of crackpot ideas, including anti-Semitic disinformation and anti-Jewish conspiracy theorizing. So it's part of it. And I think that we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We have the internet; it can do wonders, but it also is part of understanding our present issues with anti-Semitism.
Okay. Let's now move, and this is the perfect segue into it, into talking about the college campus, and what's happening on campuses. Why now? Where does this come from? And I would ask that you address both the left and the right. Here in Texas, Spencer was active early on several of our campuses, taking campus visits. And now there's other groups from the left who have been engaged. So I guess, Miriam, could you speak to this first? And then please, gentlemen, whatever you would like to add, by all means, please do.
Sure. Well, in terms of the right, I would just say that we are seeing an uptick, and some of the watchdog groups that monitor anti-Semitism, not only ADL but AJC and AMCHA, others, are actually tracking an uptick in far right anti-Semitism. You coming on to campus from the outside, leafleting about the Jews trying to usurp white America and bring in immigrants and that sort of thing. Of course, it's not mainstreamed, and typically administrations deal quite forcefully with it when there's a swastika on the campus or leafleting by far right militia or far right nationalist group. I don't think even in the 200 problem campuses, we're at the point where Jewish students en masse are saying they're afraid to wear a kippah, or they're afraid to be visibly Jewish and walk in the quad. We have some anecdotal information that some students are feeling that way. But what we do know is that they're hiding their Zionist identities, that they feel like they have to do that in order to fit in, particularly in progressive side of the campus space. We know that there are students who are being told you can't run for student government, or you're not fit to serve in student government if you're a Zionist, and they're scrubbing their resumes of trips to Israel on birthright so that they before they run on student government. And I think someone mentioned Debbie Lipstadt, who's at Emory and has written extensively on campus as well. And she says, in one of her pieces, I think it was in the Atlantic, she said that Jewish students are becoming a bit like the Marranos of yesteryear, right? Who sort of felt compelled to have to hide huge chunks of their identity from the mainstream in order to get by and in order to fit in. First of all, even before we even say, is this anti-Semitic, it's just obnoxious, right? I mean, I think we get so bogged down, is it anti-Semitism? It's simply obnoxious to tell anybody how you can be on a campus, right? So it's obnoxious to tell Jewish students or faculty or staff, you can't be fully Jewish on this campus. You can only be the kind of Jew that dehumanizes Israelis. That's the good Jew. And the bad Jew is the one that's a Zionist. And Zionism means a lot of things. There's a rich literature on campus that needs to be debated and discussed. But for a majority of Jews, we know from surveys, Zionism, however they define it, plays a role in their identity. And so you wouldn't tell Jews to stop observing Shabbat or stop eating kosher. You'd say that's bigoted or discriminatory. So why would that be different if you told students you have to disavow your Zionism in order to take part in a fossil fuel divestment campaign, or in order to take part in LGBTQ activism or Black Lives Matter? And we know that the students really want to participate. Most of the Jewish students really believe in these causes. They want to take part, and yet they feel like they can't take part because those causes and those campaigns have become so virulently anti-Zionist. So they're really ostracized. And I think that's the center problem on campus right now, and a lot of campuses right now. And administrations just don't always know how to deal with that issue, and how to make the campus, a more healthy place.
So what Miriam just described is my lived experience for the last 19 years. So thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to Academic Engagement Network, because literally this week we are working with them on my campus on much of what she described. For my part, I'd rather speak personally, which I guess would also be academically. And it's going to be a bit of a joke to start. I want to talk about Kettleman City, California. And for those who have not had an opportunity to take long road trips in California, Kettleman City is a bathroom, a gas, and food stop halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco on Interstate 5. And it's important because it's mostly a place you go to get gas and food. But for me, and I think for the topic of today, it had magical powers that were unexpected. I started my career at a community college in Los Angeles, a politically conservative community. I was the only Jewish studies trained professor, 30,000 students. And I was told by an excited group of 7 of my colleagues that they were going to have a Holocaust educator come in to 100 students, none of whom were Jewish, in order to recreate the Jerry Springer reality TV show using the Holocaust as the object of the TV show.
Oh boy.
And I considered this horrific. And when I offered what I thought was collegial help advice, I'll help you with this. I got the academic freedom of speech business. And quickly they came after me as a Jew. In fact, there was an op-ed that called me a self-hating leftist Jew. That was the idea. And it called for my firing, even though I was tenured. The threats against me became physical. Campus police refused to offer me a campus escort. And ultimately, because I was seen then as the self-hating leftist Jew, I resigned my tenure, which goes to the larger issue of what protection does tenure actually give you around campus anti-Semitism. I got in the car with my family. We drove up here to San Francisco to take the job at SF State. And I want to say that I have an endowed chair. The Goldman family endowed it as a response to 25 years of campus anti-Semitism. The chair is in Jewish social responsibility. The notion is to have a public intellectual trained in Jewish social justice who can then be the person to respond to the anti-Semites who pick it up. So I was excited to get out of LA. I was excited to get this position. And when I was unpacking my books in my new office in San Francisco, I had somehow magically in one day gone from being a self-hating leftist Jew to being a right-wing colonial Zionist imperialist. And I know Kettleman City, halfway up.
Well done.
It was an important place, but it did not change me. And it taught me, first a lot about anti-Semitism from the left and the right, what's going on college campuses, and this notion that the Jew becomes whatever the anti-Semite wants the Jew to be in order to be leveraging for wherever they were going. So in LA, I needed to be a leftist, and in San Francisco, I needed to be a right-wing person. So what I'm doing now is sort of unpacking that 400-mile drive against those two. So I'll pause that there. We can talk more later, I'm sure.
Alvin, is there anything you'd like to add?
Not a whole lot. As I mentioned before, I'm on a campus that, at least to date, it could change, but it hasn't yet, has been a very hospitable campus. I am a very visitor on the campus because I founded and for many years the Jewish Studies program, which is a large one at Indiana, and I now direct an Institute of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. So my profile is clearly identified as that of a scholar subject, but I'm also an observant Jew. And people know that. It's nothing to brag about. It's just who I am. And I've not run into problems, I'm happy to say. Indiana is a conservative state. Bloomington is in some ways exceptional in the state, being a university town. But a wholesome campus, and my own personal experience has been great. University's been entirely supportive of what I've done over many years in these areas. But we're in a period right now where things are escalating rapidly, and I don't have any guarantee that the good campus I've known all these years won't be troubled, perhaps, by a new influx of more radicalized students or faculty members or what have you. But to date, my own story, unlike Mark's, in fact, has been a fortunate one.
Okay. Mark's, your tale of two Jews, both of whom are one man, actually leads well into the next couple of questions that I would love for us to discuss. So the first one is, do any of you believe that there's been a resurgence in right-wing anti-Semitism, or if not a resurgence, just a coming out into the fore again? Or do you think that this is just more visible because we have a 24/7 news cycle? We have, as Miriam said, the internet. We had the Trump presidency, which seemed to serve as a weather vane for certain aspects of our culture. What do you think accounts for this? And is there a resurgence, or is this just a steady drumbeat that the news happens to pick up on?
I'll jump in on that. I actually want to talk about the Pittsburgh newspaper the day after, the Squirrel Hill murders. They put Aramaic letters on the banner headline, which was the mourner's Kaddish, the first words of the mourner's Kaddish. I saw that and I started to cry. The visceral reaction to seeing Hebrew, Aramaic, top of the fold, front page of a major metropolitan American newspaper was something I never in my worst nightmares thought I would ever see. And it was something that I also recognized was a statement of affirmation and solidarity. I said, I don't know who those editors were and how that decision was made, but what a statement to make. So at that moment, and then of course, all the newscasters were reminding everyone, this was the worst case of anti-Semitism in United States history. And as I'm an American Jewish historian, that's my training and my teaching. And I was angry that I was living in a time that I had to hear that, really, because I thought that time was over. And I think that we are seeing a huge uptick in the amount, in the intensity, and in the implications of this as part of a lot of the larger political, issues that we've been discussing.
Okay. Alan or Miriam, anything to add?
Well, yeah. I think we should mention Charlottesville, which clearly put on display a right group that felt it was feeling its oats for a bunch of different reasons. And there it was, shouting slogans that were pretty vicious. Some of the people were armed as well. There has been, there's been a revival for sure of right-wing activism taking the form of white supremacy, white nationalism, Christian nationalism as well. How large it is, I can't tell you. I'm not sure that anyone knows for sure. It felt empowered under the Trump presidency, although I won't say that President Trump himself was a white supremacist. My reading of President Trump is that he was a self-serving, non-ideological kind of figure. So I don't think he was a white supremacist, but white supremacists felt encouraged by him, that's for sure. But I wouldn't confine today's troubles, especially as they target Jews, exclusively on the right. That wouldn't be true. A lot of physical assaults on Jews today goes underreported and unreported. And the more one learns about who the assailants are, I think it's clear that white supremacy, while it needs to be watched closely, is not responsible for much of the urban crime against Jews.
So that was actually a segue into my next question, which was about the left. But before we do that, Miriam, it sounded like you had something you wanted to say. So let's go there first.
Two quick points. I wanted to just on this question of resurgence of right-wing anti-Semitism mention that it's getting more sophisticated and more able to move from the fringes into the mainstream. And the example I wanted to give was the blood libeling surrounding COVID. And, obviously blaming Jews for disease and illness goes all the way back, right? Poisoning the wells. And so when COVID hit, you saw that immediately, right? So very quickly on social media, blaming the Jews for COVID and all these unhinged allegations that Jews are using COVID to make money and expand global control. And it's the age-old classic blood libel. And it wasn't very surprising. And of course, it was white supremacists pushing that. And then we saw more of that anti-Semitic conspiracy theorizing around the vaccine, right? So white supremacist messaging, trying to convince people that the vaccine is a Jewish plot for population control and sterilizing white people, and just the most absurd stuff that you'd say, okay, this is so fringe. But look how sophisticated it got. Jews are trying to take away your civil rights and your liberties by preventing the unvaccinated from working and traveling and going to school. And suddenly we saw like politicians saying this, and it's not as loopy to many, right? And it's something that can actually filter into the mainstream. And so I think that's really worrying, and we have to monitor that and pay attention to that. And the other point I wanted to make is that I don't think we can just separate the right and the left in the way that it's often done. And particularly on campus, I think it's becoming less and less sort of analytically or, even sort of how you deal with the campus climate. Because we do see on many campuses that when you get year after year virulent campaigns that delegitimize Zionism, dehumanize Israelis, demonize Israel, you get swastikas on the campus. Okay, and it's not that the virulently anti-Zionist, anti-Israel group is putting the swastikas. They're not. But for some reason, the far right in the vicinity, in the area, sees those campuses as fertile territory. Right? If you hate on Israel so much, yeah, you're probably going to hate on the Jews. So that's a campus that's ripe. And that's where we see the swastikas coming on and the leafleting and the flyering. So again, it's not as delinked. We also know that far right will use the material of the far left. So you often see some of the campaigns that are developed, like Deadly Exchange, which alleges that Israel and American Jewish organizations conspire to train America's police forces to harm Black people. Guess what? That was developed on the left, on the far left, and disseminated, and still today, it's a campaign that was developed in 2017. It's still going strong. But the David Dukes of the world and the far right, 8chan and 4chan, are disseminating that material. They're taking it straight from the far left. So I don't think we can just say, okay, let's talk about the right and now let's talk about the left, as if these are hermetically sealed arenas. So that's the second point I wanted to make.
Well, and I would add to this that in an era of incredible rapid fire traffic of, I hesitate to call them ideas, at least ideologies, for lack of a better word, the left and the right online get completely jumbled up. No question about that. So we have done some talking about the right. Let's talk a little bit about the left, and then there's one more question that I'd like to bring up, and then we'll open for audience questions. So talk about what you see as the main sources today of left-wing anti-Semitism. Because while they may share information, they may share some of the materials, their sources are not necessarily the same.
Who wants to start? We could do 2 hours on this, Sarah.
No, these are quick. These are quick. I know.
I'll jump in with a quick history thing on this too, which also will link in, I think, to your next question. There's an Academy Award nominated documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. Put it on your COVID watch list. And in the middle of the Berkeley in the 60s, all of the students are in Sproul Hall having a sit-in against whatever they're doing. And magically, it seems, the Israeli folk song Tsena Tsena starts playing, and the student protesters jump to their feet and do Israeli folk dancing. And I show this to my students to demonstrate how far we've come from where the left is, and Jews and ultimately Zionism, that the Berkeley protesters saw no conflict between being leftist and being a fully identified Jew. And Israel was a socialist utopia in the minds of the American left in the 50s and through the mid 1960s. What I see happening today is actually nothing new. I think in the mid 60s, the left flipped. It became anti-Zionist. And to answer your question, Sarah, directly, it's about perception of Jewish power, abuse of Jewish power, and the way in which white Jews have become the new oppressors. So for white Jews who were engaged in civil rights work in the United States in the 50s and early 60s, one day to find out they are now being seen as, or white Israelis are now being seen as the Southern sheriffs from the civil rights movement, there's a new framing. And this frame is that Jews are about power and abusing the power and abusing marginalized communities. This is contrary to what was happening in the decade before in the US. And I argue, at least this is for me, what's happening on college campuses today from the left is really just a continual replay of this trope around Jews abusing their power and privilege to bring harm to larger communities.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, however, Mark, I don't know if you agree or don't agree, that what you just described, while it exists, is a total misreading of the actual situation of Jews in America.
Right.
And that's important for us to keep it. I think myself, the potentially most destructive manifestation of anti-Semitism today is what passes as anti-Zionism. And we really do need to talk about what Zionism is. Zionism affirms the right of the Jewish people to political sovereignty and independence in their own country. That country has existed since 1948. I myself am an open, unapologetic, proud Zionist. My daughter is in Israel. I have 3 grandchildren growing up in Israel. Constantly. There's no Jewish future worthy the name without the state of Israel. So while this country is not perfect by any means, look at our country, it's far from perfect. One can certainly criticize no end of things about America. It stands in need of criticism. If the goal of criticism is to be a better America, the same is true with regard to Israel. Israel's not perfect. Of criticizing Israel is to make a still better Israel, I can only applaud such criticism. If the criticism, however, delegitimizes the entire Zionist project and says that the creation of the state in 48 was an historical injustice and that this has no right to a future, Israel and Israel alone among the world's states negated in that respect. It doesn't even matter if you call it anti-Semitism. It's a form of ferocious hostility that we have to stand against with everything we have.
Okay. So that actually is a segue into the final question that we'll have right now, which is how does Zionism in Israel fit into this conversation? And why do events in Israel have such an incredible impact on the level of anti-Semitism in the US? And I would just add to this, many years ago, there was it's just a brief comment in an article that was written by Ruth Weiss. And it was very interesting. She talked about 67 in many ways being a turning point in kind of world view of Israel and others' views of Israel, because Israel went from being this underdog to being this, this mighty power, at least in theory. And the comment that she made, which was very interesting, was she said, the 1948 to 1967 Israel was considered a somewhat moral Israel because it was an imperiled Israel and a very tiny Israel. So then, as Israel got bigger, Israel became more of a threat, more of a power, and less of something that you should champion. So she said, following this logic out, the most moral Israel would be an Israel that only exists in people's hearts and minds and doesn't physically exist on the map. I mean, it was a very interesting comment to make. But I would like all of you to respond to how Zionism in Israel fit into the current moment, and why anti-Semitism in the US has really spiked because of these connections.
So maybe I can start here and also add something from the last question. I think it's important to recognize that there are just some ways of talking about Israel that cross the line. And I think we can actually, as scholars and as analysts, we can show some of those examples. And I think, when criticism is not about policy or about a specific aspect of Israeli state or society that could be potentially reformed, right? All that's legitimate, right? Even scathing critical criticism. But when it's eliminationist, as Alvin, just pointed out, when it actually rejects the very idea and existence of Israel, where, by the way, almost half of world Jewry lives. Okay, so half of world Jewry is in that country, right? So are you gonna threaten half of world Jewry? It's a stance that is actually antagonistic to the continuity and well-being of Judaism and of the Jewish people, right? So I always go back to the late chief rabbi of Britain, Lord Jonathan Sacks, who called anti-Zionism the anti-Semitism of our time, because it denies the rights of Jews to exist collectively as Jews, right, with the same rights as everyone else. And I think that's really important to understand that there is a way to be pro-Palestinian and to champion Palestinian rights and to be very, very critical of Israeli policies without targeting Jews. So, for example, well before this May's events of targeting Jews because you were upset about Israel, Hillels across the country were being defaced with Free Palestine, right? And a sukkah was defaced with graffiti, Free Palestine. And what does that mean? That Jewish Americans and Jewish property in America is serving as a stand-in or as a proxy for Israel, that American Jews are being made to pay or to answer for Israel. Like they're just going about their daily lives on campus or off campus. Why do they have to say anything about Israel, right? So I think holding Jews responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, it's a hallmark of anti-Semitic thinking. And it's in the IHRA definition for a reason. So we can call that out and we can say, that's not really a good means of supporting the Palestinian or the Arab cause. Do it differently, and we can help students and others. Could be a teachable moment. I would be the first to say students are not David Dukes or Louis Farrakhan's they're kids that are making mistakes. They're very passionate about social justice. So, we can make these teachable moments. But I did want to mention something about social justice. Social justice is the most important cause of our time, right, today. And when you look at social justice and you see the terms that are bandied about, apartheid, occupation, right? Well, the social justice warriors are not looking at the Muslim Rohingya and they're not looking at the Roma in Europe who face apartheid and discrimination. There's a fixation on Israel. There's a fixation on Jewish alleged wrongdoings, and that's where apartheid finds a market. I went back yesterday preparing for tonight to Jeffrey Goldberg. He had a great article in the Atlantic a few years back where he said that the social justice community on the far left is not really concerned with apartheid or occupation. What they're interested in is a Jewish moral failure, and it's almost like a pornographic interest, and so that's really problematic. It's this obsession. And the last thing I would just add is, if you're a historian and you know something about Soviet anti-Semitism in the 60s and 70s, you'll see a lot of what's going on today. So the whole Zionism is racism, even the cartoons and the images that we see today were rife Soviet-style anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitic anti-Zionism has a long pedigree, and the similarities to the Soviet style in today is really uncanny.
Mark and Alvin, would either one of you like to comment on Zionism and Israel fitting into the conversation?
Sure. Here's my considered academic opinion. What a mess. It's incredible. And Sarah, what you opened with before with Sarah Weiss's article about 67 or 48, I really think that's the essential question.
Yeah.
If the objection is to the occupation after the 1967 Six-Day War, that's one conversation. If the objection is to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, it's separate. And I think that we have a lot of distrust on all sides about whether it's 67 or 48, regardless of what anyone on any side is saying. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think you asked why it is that Israel, sort of spikes anti-Semitism here. I think it's aligning with a lot of the tropes of leftist anti-Semitism. And that is that there's a perception, and Alvin, I'm making the argument now that I agree with it, but I'm giving the argument as they would say, this would be an abuse of power, right? That the Israeli military or Jewish power, is occurring. That this is abuse of power by white people over non-white people. And that would be the local part. And then the international part is the solidarity notion, what has become known as intersectionality, though that's not actually what it is, but that's what it's been politicized to mean. And this is a notion that American-based racial ethnic minority groups then need to join the solidarity cause to be anti-Zionist as part of their anti-racist work. And that also makes the definitions more difficult. When is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism? The University of California came out with a policy on this. And the night before they published it, they put out like a private reading, and everyone got really upset because they didn't define when anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. So they wrote in, hours before that they condemn all anti-Zionism that's anti-Semitic. And like that was what the line said, but it didn't give us any help to know what that is. So ultimately, we have to line up our definitions of those words, and we're not going to do that tonight. But I'll just say once we line up what each of those words mean, then we can do the compare and contrast to see if it applies. Most people who are arguing are actually arguing different definitions of each side, according to usually whatever their political purpose is. And then I think people are talking past each other. I wanted to give one specific example. At my campus, after Trump was elected, students organized a Know Your Rights fair. This was that student groups could help other student groups know their rights. And Hillel, went in to have a table so that they could talk about all the Jewish organizations that are immigrant rights organizations and the rest of it. And they were uninvited. They were kicked out. And what we later found out was that they were kicked out because they were Hillel, that this was done by unanimous secret vote of a committee that included faculty and administrators, and that they created a cover-up to say they ran out of space. And then after they did all this, they invited an off-campus Jewish anti-Zionist group to have a table in order to insulate themselves from the charge of anti-Semitism, saying, we got rid of Hillel because it's a Zionist organization, and to prove it's not anti-Semitic, we brought in these Jews, right? In the first round, the university bought that argument, right? It ultimately led to federal and state lawsuits and a landmark legal agreement where the Cal State system, 500,000 students, now officially says that Zionism is a part of Jewish identity. So that when you are pushing saying you're pushing out Zionists and you're pushing out the only Jewish, like we have an Israel advocacy group on campus, you could make a better claim you're getting rid of the Zionist group, but when you're getting rid of the Jewish student group, Hillel, that's where it crossed the line.
Okay. All right, Alvin, is this one you want to address, or would you like us to go on to audience questions? Your choice.
Just very briefly, Miriam quoted Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was a towering figure among us until this past year when he passed away. A great intellectual figure and a great spiritual leader at the same time. So I'll just add a few more words, Miriam, from him. Probably we were quoting from the same thing. Anti-Semitism means denying the right of Jews to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as everyone else. It takes different forms in different ages. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th and 20th century, they were hated because of their race. Today, they are hated because of the nation state, the state of Israel. Mark mentioned there are two different conversations going on. One is about 67 and its consequences. One is about 1948. I can see participating in a conversation about the first of those. The second one doesn't lead to a conversation. The state of Israel was created in 1948. It exists. It's been thriving in many ways. It's not without problems. But if one wants to question the very existence of the state of Israel, you can't have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Let's move quickly through some audience questions. There's a number of them. We'll get to those that we can. The first question is, do you think social media is fostering anti-Semitism in young people specifically? Or do you think social media just makes existing anti-Semitism more visible?
I don't think any one of the three of us actually is a scholar of social media. Miriam, I know you and I are not, I don't know if you are.
So I think that this is more of what your opinion is.
What we do know is this, the single most prolific disseminator of hate speech, including anti-Semitic hate speech, is the internet. And what goes on social media, appealing to both younger people and older people, is very bad stuff, time and again. What is it again? Listener wants to know. Would you repeat it, please?
Oh, if it's specifically affecting young people and a growth of anti-Semitism amongst young people, or it's just making anti-Semitism more visible?
Probably doing both. Miriam said she likes to quote data, and I don't think any one of the three of us has that data, but I think it's doing both.
Okay, all right. Okay, can you speak to anti-Semitism in the women's movement? This questioner doesn't say if they mean earlier in the 20th century or currently. I would say maybe currently, specifically because you're all campus-based. I would add to what's going on in women and gender studies. I mean, there was the recent Palestinian collective, a feminist collective. So if you could speak to that issue, I guess Miriam, will start with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. Actually, Mark mentioned intersectionality, and if we want to talk about campus and the roots of anti-Semitism on the left and on campus, we have to look at how the whole paradigm of intersectionality developed as a really important analytical framework for thinking about interlocking identities, right? Gender, race, and for an individual, and how an individual could be discriminated against because the state or the employer would only be looking at one of those identities rather than the other. So intersectionality, I mean, I studied it as a grad student in political science, as an important and compelling a framework and theoretical tool, but it became this sort of rallying cry for political activism and jumbling things together that like apples and oranges, and sort of this solidarity and collective victimhood, and the repository par excellence on campus for this has been women's and gender studies. It's not surprising that discipline was the first to support the academic boycott of Israeli academia, and has continued to be a place where there really is not any room for the kind of studies of Israel, of Palestine, of the conflict that all three of us would champion as open, rigorous theorizing. And recently, during the May uptick in hostilities between Israel and Hamas, we saw over 120 women and gender studies programs across the country sign on to a very one-sided and biased declaration. And when departments do that, individual faculty can sign whatever they like. They have the academic freedom. They can be are independent scholars and can speak to public matters. And they're also American citizens and can tweet, on social media or post Facebook what they like. But a department speaks for the university. And so, we're engaging at AAN on these issues because they do raise concerns. Can you even be a Zionist Jew, a proud Zionist Jew as Alvin is, in a department of women and gender studies and today, right? And what does it mean for students? How is student speech chilled? So, I think there's I could give just one example. It has nothing to do with internet. The law school student organization and a prominent American public university that has a mission statement. It says we're anti-racist, we hate Islamophobia, homophobia, we're against racism, and we're also against Zionism. And in a chain of the most ugly and horrid and awful ideologies, we also hate Zionism. And that is up on an official website of a major US university. It has been for 2 months. We can't get it off. What does that mean when Zionists and Jews, most Jews see Zionism as a central part of their identity, are disparaged and demoralized in this way? And so I think we do see this in some disciplines, not in the STEM fields, but we see it in some pockets of the humanities and the softer social sciences. And we have, for the health of the campuses, we have to continue to combat that.
Okay. Alvin or Mark, any?
Yeah. In fact, I want to center the work of Amanda Berman. Amanda, I met because she was the one that sued my university for anti-Semitism. And in the midst of the lawsuit, she went to the Dyke March. And I don't know if this is what the reference was from the person who asked the question.
I remember what you're talking about.
This is an infamous moment when Jews who carried, anything that looked like an Israeli flag or a Star of David were told that they had to leave. They were not permitted to march for women's rights, if they were Zionist. And it so affected Amanda that she actually left her job suing my university and formed Zioness, an organization that's committed to being progressive and feminist and Zionist unapologetically. So she's living exactly in the middle of that space and where Miriam was describing.
Okay. Another question, and this is actually it's asking you for kind of a current socio-political analysis, but I'll ask it and then we'll go to our final question. This questioner says that they live in Tennessee, which is one of the states in which the governor has passed a bill banning the teaching of critical race theory. This is something potentially that may happen here in Texas as well. And they ask a very interesting question. They say, do you see any states taking this a step further and passing bills banning the teaching of the Holocaust or history relating to anti-Semitism? I mean, it's an interesting question because it's combining fears of the left, fears of the right into one kind of interesting package. Do you have any views on that?
I don't.
Sorry.
Please.
I would no longer recognize America as America. If in fact such a thing were to happen. Now, there are things already beginning to happen, in fact, which do erode what I've always loved about America, more and more illiberalism of various kinds, which is dangerous and it erodes democracy. Is it conceivable that a state might pass a mandate forbidding the teaching of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism? God help us if so. I'd like to believe it could never happen, but we're living in crazy times. So I guess one can't discount any kind of possibility. What Miriam said before about a law school having that statement up on its website tells me that law school has been corrupted. And I've lived, I'll pull my seniority. I'm in my 53rd year of teaching at the university level. The university, because it's been a venue for free inquiry and debate and discussion of the very best kind. But everything we're discussing cuts that down and subverts the very raison d'etre, the reason for universities to be, ultimately corrupting. And if it gets to the school level, then it's hopeless altogether.
Okay.
This is a fascinating question. And Sarah, what you're saying initially, like when I first looked at it, I said, this makes no sense. But the more I think about it, it's actually quite profound. Critical race, opponents of critical race theory are basically folks pushing back against the anti-Black racist movement, right? Because critical race theory argues that race matters. So they're trying to remove from the educational pedagogy the notion that race matters. And anti-Semitism, Holocaust studies would appear to be for white Jews on the opposite side. So no, I don't see that happening, because I think the group that doesn't want CRT probably wants to keep Holocaust studies. I think it's internally consistent. But what this really points out, if we just dig a little bit, is the extent to which racism and anti-Semitism are related. And for this, we look to Black Jews and the Jews of color community, whose experience of anti-Semitism and of racism and allegiance to critical race theory as quite true, and who also suffer from anti-Semitism, really make that kind of split or dichotomy really complex and fascinating.
Okay. All right. Last question. It's as follows. We're going to be talking about how to combat anti-Semitism in the final session of this crucial conversation series. However, I wanted to wrap up the program this evening by asking each of you to share one way that we can push back against anti-Semitism in the United States. And I will start, and I'll go across my screen. So I'll start with Alvin, then go to Miriam, and then go to Mark. Okay, so Alvin.
Right. I'm sometimes asked what I've learned about antisemitism, and I spend every day and night, except Shabbos, monitoring it, studying it, trying to understand it. So I'm sometimes asked what I've learned about anti-Semitism that can change the hearts and minds of anti-Semites. And my answer is this: if what we mean by anti-Semites are hardcore anti-Semites, I've learned nothing. that would change the hearts and minds of hardcore anti-Semites. I don't think it's possible to do it. We just have to protect ourselves against it. But most Americans are decent people. They're not anti-Semites, hardcore or otherwise. Often they're uninformed. They need to be educated in the right ways. And I think once that begins to take place, the chances of dampening down some anti-Semitism go up. But right now, it's not a good time. There's a great deal of hostility, a great deal of passionate feelings against Jews in the Jewish state. So we can only do our best. I'm not hopeless about it, but we have to just keep working, and do what we can.
Miriam.
Another question that we could take 2 hours on, but I also want to talk about that middle group, not the extremists on either side, but the middle group who don't harbor any ill will, but are using tropes and canards, and are making everything about Jews. So I think we have to insist on a better discourse. We have to insist and encourage, respectful debate and dialogue, civil dialogue around contentious issues. We need to model that, that you can do that on campus, off campus, without denigrating Jews, without ostracizing them, and without making it all about the Jews. And the example I wanted to give was how we're seeing more and more people don't like a particular policy, political policy. Their go-to place is, it's Kristallnacht, right? Or it's akin to the Holocaust, right? So COVID health guidelines is Nazi era laws persecuting Jews, the anti-vaccine passport, or all the certification protests in the UK and in the US. People were wearing yellow stars of David. Don't do that. When you talk to these people, actually, and media did, they find they're not haters. They just thought, this is how I feel so wronged by this policy, that my go-to place is to show this other wrong, which was the Holocaust. And I think that's where the education comes in, right? That please don't use the Jews for your political platform, right? Keep us out of it. And explain how that's dishonoring the memories of Jewish Holocaust victims. And as an educator, I believe a lot can be a teachable moment. Obviously, you have to also condemn it, call it out, expose it. But we are seeing a lot of this, sort of the Jews dragged into every conversation. And I'd like to be taken out of the conversations, a little bit less about the Jews. So that's my one solution.
Mark.
One of the many goals of anti-Semites are to isolate and persecute Jews. So if Jews are facing persecution and isolation, the antidote is alliance and solidarity. And here is where an irony is actually a blessing and a gift. The sad truth is anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism and a lot of the other isms are related to one another. And I think one of the goals of those who hate Jews is to prevent Jews and other marginalized groups from getting together and supporting one another. So even as we will inevitably face internal challenges and intergroup challenges as we do, and I did see some of the questions were referencing that, this is actually the time for us to understand that the enemy is the same. And it would be really nice if humanity drew us together because we care about one another because we're all people. If that's not going to work, I think we're all self-interested to say that it's time for us to work through whatever smaller issues we have, because the much bigger issues are far more important.
Okay. And with that response, I would like to thank all three of our panelists. So Dr. Alvin Rosenfeld, Dr. Miriam Ellman, and Dr. Mark Dollinger for this just really enlivening and enlightening conversation. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us this evening, and to ask you to join us for our next crucial conversation which will be dealing with the topic of global anti-Semitism with a focus specifically on Europe, and that will be July 1st at 7 p.m. Thank you all so very much.